This program is brought to you by Stanford University.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. And Lee Johnson called a week or so ago and said, how about talking to the energy seminar and how about next Wednesday? So here I am. I want to talk about a book that I'm working on, maybe not as rapidly as my publisher would like me to work on it, which is about how to think about the political and regulatory dimensions of the greenhouse gas problem. And one way to start the talk today is with the famous Rorschach Test. So the idea here, this is a personality test, is you can look at this ink blot and tell the examiner what you see in the ink blot, and that reveals something about your personality and your hopes and your fears and so on. Within a week, we're going to have a massive transition in Washington that can be looked at a little bit like the Rorschach Test. People see in the shift from the Bush administration to the Obama administration their wildest hopes and fears. And maybe in the issue of climate change, this is especially evident, where folks imagine that finally we're going to re-engage with the world and we're going to come in, we're going to do the right thing at the final moment. It's going to be like that final scene in the first Star Wars where Luke re-engages and then he attacks the Death Star and the world, the universe in that case, is actually safe. The argument I'd like to make today is that while there's no doubt going to be a lot changing in Washington and a lot of change in attitude and engagement and so on, that the problems the United States has had in dealing with regulation of greenhouse gases, and in particular the international regulation of greenhouse gases, are structural. They depend less on who's in the White House and who's on Capitol Hill, and more on the structure of the problem. And almost nobody disagrees with the proposition that we need to do something urgently and seriously to regulate emissions of greenhouse gases. What we haven't paid enough attention to is how you'd actually do that, how you would get the form of the regulatory instrument to match the functions that we're trying to perform here. And so I want to talk a little bit about that issue today in my remarks and give you a sense of what I think is going on and what would be valuable. I'm going to talk for half an hour or so, which means that, well, we're in a different time zone here, but I'll talk for half an hour or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. One way to start thinking about this problem is to rewind the tape of history back to 1990 and ask yourself, what was the conventional wisdom at the time as to how we should regulate greenhouse gases at the international level? Because it's not the only international pollutant problem we've addressed in the past. We've addressed a whole bunch of them. And there was a conventional wisdom that had arisen at the time. I want to just tick off the major elements of it, because thinking about where these elements have worked and not worked, especially through the lens of the Kyoto Treaty, I'll argue will help us think in a sharper way about what you could do better in the future. So the conventional wisdom was, first, this is a really serious problem, and therefore we need to have really serious commitments. And that means under international law, they need to be treaties negotiated by diplomats, signed and ratified by governments. The ratification process varies across countries, but this really puts them into law, and they become, some people say, the concept of international law is an oxymoron, but they become the most serious legal instruments we have available at the international level. Second part of the conventional wisdom is that we need to codify these commitments in the form of targets and timetables for regulating emissions. An output measure, an actual outcome from major economies rather than an input. There's an interesting mapping on the prices versus quantities debate for those of you who were involved in that discussion. And the reason is that way we're sure what will be delivered to the environment. And then if somebody's backsliding on their commitments, because these are legally binding commitments, we'll know about that, and this will help prevent backsliding and assure compliance with these international commitments. The third part of the conventional wisdom was that we need to have universal participation. All countries, to wildly varying degrees, contribute to the problem, and therefore all of them need to be part of the solution. And we put this under the UN framework, and we have negotiations that involve 180 countries that are truly universal. And the thinking is that not only do all countries contribute to the problem and therefore need to be part of the solution, but that by making the commitments universal, they become more legitimate. And if the commitments are more legitimate, they'll be more effective. And there's a body of thinking about legitimacy in international law that argues, in a somewhat tortured way in my view, that legitimacy leads to much more effective instruments. The last part here, inserted especially by the United States, which then promptly bailed from the scheme, is that we need to have an integrated market for greenhouse gas reductions. If you do all the previous parts and you have targets and timetables for emissions, then countries and ultimately firms might be able to trade those emission credits or rights internationally, and then you have a single global price for carbon, and that would lead to the most efficient, at least economically cost-effective solution at the international level. The fifth part of the conventional wisdom is that developing countries, which didn't want to pay for this on their own, would have to be engaged in one way or another through compensation. And we've had some history of this in international environmental law, where we have actually formal funding mechanisms attached to most international environmental treaties today that in effect pay off the developing countries. There's a big question in international law as to what is a developing country, a really interesting history there, that pay them off for the extra cost of complying with the agreement. And then the last part of this, which was never really, actually most people don't talk about, but was assumed, is that if you did all these 5 things right, that innovation would not follow automatically, but more or less would follow logically from the regulatory incentives that would exist up there. So you start putting the screws on carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. That creates an incentive for firms and governments to go off and invest in new technology. And as we all know, the only way you're really going to solve this problem is with pretty radical technological innovation, and that will follow from having done the first parts correctly. That was the conventional wisdom in the early 1990s. A lot of what we do in the university setting is we come up with new ideas and then we run around and tell everybody, well, gee, if you just followed our ideas, the world would be better off. And in fact, in this case, the patient followed the doctor's orders completely. The Kyoto Treaty that was negotiated, and many of you in this room probably studied this very closely, the Kyoto Treaty followed this more or less lock, stock, and barrel. And it had, for example, targets and timetables for the advanced industrialized countries, the 38 countries. It was legally binding. It had a compensation mechanism for developing countries. That compensation mechanism didn't involve sending cash to the developing countries because that was seen to be politically somewhat radioactive. So instead we had a scheme that's called the Clean Development Mechanism, where if somebody goes and invests in a project in a developing country that reduces emissions, they can get a credit for that in their home country, and that in effect is valuable. Michael Wara, sitting here, has done a lot of work in this area, some of it with me, to try and show that that mechanism actually hasn't worked very well. It's sent a lot of cash around the world, but hasn't actually caused much in the way of reductions. And so the patient followed the doctor's orders completely. What's actually happened in terms of changes in behavior, or if you like, effectiveness of this agreement? I want to talk a little bit about that, and then I want to pivot and talk about some different ways, and I would argue much more effective ways to think about the coordination of regulatory problems here. And to be simple and blunt, roughly nothing has happened in terms of actual controls on emissions. There's been a little bit of changes at the margin. Now, this is a pretty bold proposition, so I want to just walk through this in the case of a few of the most important countries. For those of you who study game theory, in effect what we have is a non-cooperative outcome here, where more or less everybody's just gone off and done what they would have done anyway, but they along the way have said, gee, with the exception of a couple countries, including this one, gee, we're part of the Kyoto Treaty. That's a problem, because if you really want to solve the global warming problem, you're going to have to make deep reductions in emissions and not have everybody just running off and doing what they would have done anyway. How do we defend that proposition? Well, ultimately, you'd have to go country by country and look and ask yourself, how much did the existence of these regulatory mechanisms actually cause changes in behavior? I've done that to some degree. There's a literature in this area, and I want to just give you a synopsis of what that literature shows. First of all, there's been almost no change in behavior in essentially all of the developing countries, with the exception of a few clean development mechanism projects at the margin, but basically no change in behavior in the developing countries, so I'm going to set them aside. The United States famously hasn't had much change in behavior. A lot of people think that's because the Bush administration was in power, and there's no question that they were not the most helpful administration on this issue. But in my view, the reason the United States is not part of this treaty is just much more fundamental. If you rewind the tape of history back to the time when the Kyoto Treaty was being negotiated, and you ask yourselves, what's actually happened in the period since the treaty was negotiated to the present day when real countries had to think about making real efforts to comply with the agreements. There's no scenario under which the United States actually could comply with the commitment. So the Bush administration had no choice but to withdraw. What they did, in a very offensive way, was to not do anything that was serious as an alternative. What I've done here in this chart is just rewound that tape of history, and I'm showing for the three major industrialized countries that did most of the negotiating in Kyoto about actual commitments and made most of the commitments. Here, I've stopped their emissions. The vertical axis is million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year. This is not all the greenhouse gases, but these are the most important of the greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels. And I'm showing the data for the United States, the European Union. The original, as everybody knows, there are 27 members of the European Union now. At the time, there were 15 negotiating the commitment, and Japan. And I've stopped the data at the point where the people sitting around the negotiating table in Kyoto would have known something about what was actually going on. The 1990 is the base year for the Kyoto commitments, and then these bars out here are the commitments that are listed in the schedule in the back of the treaty that the countries actually signed on to. So the United States signed on to a 7% reduction below 1990 levels, the European Union an 8% reduction below 1990 levels, Japan a 6% reduction around 1990 levels. And there's some footnotes that matter, and there's some tweaking of this here and there, but that's the basic story. Now you can roll the tape of history forward and ask yourself what actually happened in the period from when Kyoto was negotiated to when real countries faced the question of whether to ratify and bring the treaty into force and to adopt policies. And this is what happened. EU emissions were roughly flat, or actually now starting to rise slightly. Mainly, no question the Europeans adopted real policies, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but mainly because the Kyoto accounting framework allows Germany to take credit for the digestion of East Germany. East Germany is a very inefficient economy, and so West Germany got a boost, if you like, from being able to digest that economy and had lower emissions. Some changes in the British, mainly power sector, to favor lower carbon fuels that had nothing to do with climate policy. And so you could see that when the Europeans started actually putting policies into place, that it was at least plausible that you could come close to compliance with the treaty. The same is true with Japan. The United States, it was already clear before the Bush administration took office that there was no way under any scenario the US actually could have complied, with one exception, which is we could have bought a lot of credits from Russia, because Russia famously agreed, the enormous concession, to freeze its emissions at 1990 levels but during the years 2008 to 2012. But since the Russian economy had collapsed in the run-up to Kyoto, the emissions actually were already 40% below 1990 levels. So we could have bought credits from Russia and complied formally with the treaty. I don't know how you take a treaty up to the Senate for ratification and you say, well, we're not actually going to do very much here. What we do is going to be expensive, but we're going to buy $20 or $50 billion worth of more or less fictitious emission credits from Russia, and then we'll actually comply with the treaty. This story, I think, is very well known, but it underscores something that's extremely important about our experience with binding international treaties in problems where governments don't have complete control over the outputs, which is the treaties, if they're ambitious, are also necessarily brittle. If circumstances on the ground change radically, or if governments don't accurately forecast what's going to happen, then they face commitments that are brittle and often very difficult to adjust, and they, in the extreme form, have no option but to withdraw or avoid the treaty. And that fundamentally is what the United States did. Well, maybe you say the United States, it's an exception, that's too bad. Well, at least Europe has an aggressive scheme. Famously, the Europeans have an emissions trading system that puts a price on carbon. I'll show you some data on that trading system in a little bit. Well, the reality is that while Europe has definitely done some things, most of the European effort to comply with the Kyoto Treaty is through these credits that they're buying from the developing countries, these Clean Development Mechanism credits. Chart's a little bit dated here, but this shows the emissions from the industrial sources in Europe. The European trading system only covers industrial sources of greenhouse gases. Same vertical axis as before, million metric tons of CO2. These are industrial emissions from European industry. And the green bar on the right here is the level at which those emissions would have to be for Europe roughly to comply with the Kyoto Treaty. The gray bar, the top of this whole thing, is the level at which they're likely to be during the 2008 to 2012 period. Nobody's quite sure, but something like 2/3 to perhaps 90% of the actual European effort towards compliance with the Kyoto Treaty is coming in the form of the Clean Development Mechanism credits. In my view, the vast majority of those credits are, for lack of a better term, bogus, although there's a big debate as to what fraction are bogus. Maybe it's only 1/3 that are bogus, maybe it's 2/3 that are bogus. Some people see further extremes. But more or less what's going on is you have an enormous effort driven by the need and desire to comply with the treaty, but not actually much underlying change in behavior. Last point I want to make in this area, and then I want to shift and talk about some constructive solutions to this. At least, you might say, at least, even if we're not doing a very good job in actually reducing emissions, at least right now we're investing in technologies so that we'll be better placed in the future to control our emissions. And that story, I think, also is largely bogus. We're talking a lot about these emissions, these investments in new technologies, and there are some really interesting initiatives. A lot's happened in renewable power. A lot's happened in a few other areas of energy, some interesting stuff in automobiles. But when you look at the totality of effort, what is striking is how little's actually happening on the ground. And let me illustrate that with one example, which is the famous case of carbon storage. Almost everybody thinks that coal is with us for the future because it's politically essential and economically essential. And the only way you're going to square having lots of coal in the energy system with also cutting carbon is some kind of technology that captures the CO2 from coal plants and then allows us to store it someplace that's not in the atmosphere causing global warming. We've done a lot of interesting work on this here at Stanford. This is a really important area of research. It is politically and technologically pivotal to getting serious about global warming. We, and I don't know if Varun Rai is here today, but Varun Rai and our group and several other people have been tracking now every single carbon storage project announcement anywhere in the world and assigning a probability that the project is actually going to come into existence, which comes from studying individual projects and seeing what's actually happening. And this chart here shows over time out to the year 2025 a supply curve, if you like, for the amount of actual effort in carbon storage. So what we've done is we've taken individual projects. There's a working paper on our website, working paper number 76, that identifies all these projects and assigns the probabilities. And then you can look over time at the volume, a million metric tons of CO2 captured per year and stored per year. You can look at the volume of effort and ask yourself, do these volumes, which if you look at actual likely projects are down in the neighborhood of 20 million tons of CO2 per year, possible or probable projects maybe up to 100 million tons a year, and then some kind of vaporware up above 100 million tons a year. If you look at the actual level of effort right now, maybe we're on track to do 100 million tons of CO2 per year by the year 2025. I'd be actually shocked if we get to that point. I think the financial crisis is going to take a real hit on this technology. And so this is one example of many, and obviously ultimately you have to look at all the individual technologies, where what's actually happening on the ground is totally removed from the level of effort that would be needed. To put 100 million tons of CO2 into perspective, that is maybe, the current level of effort is maybe 1%, maybe 1/10 of 1% of what you would need for carbon capture and storage to play a substantial role in decarbonizing the whole energy system over the next few decades in a way that's consistent with stabilizing carbon dioxide emissions at something on the order of 500 million parts per million. So I want to underscore something in terms of looking at the history, which is that we have very high levels of formal compliance with the Kyoto Treaty. Everybody more or less looks to be on track to comply, and the countries that aren't on track to comply aren't actually in the treaty. But that formal high level of compliance doesn't tell us anything about level of effort. And one thing we learn looking at this historical experience is the level of effort has actually been extremely modest. And part of that is because the political will, if you like, the pressure to do something about the problem and spend real money on the problem has not been there. And part of it I'd like to suggest to you is because of the instruments, the legal instruments that have been used and the way those instruments operate and how governments think about allocating risk in those instruments. And that's what I'd like to talk about now for a few minutes. So I'm in the middle of writing this book that tries to work out all the major dimensions of choice when you choose an international instrument, international institution, to address some kind of a shared international problem like global warming. And those major dimensions are the geometry. Do you have a universal agreement, or do you have smaller, what clubs, smaller groups of countries. Codification, do you codify this as a legally binding treaty or some other kind of an agreement? Agency, who negotiates? Do you have diplomats negotiate? Do you have heads of state negotiate? And so there's really interesting literature that looks at the agents in negotiations and argues that the choice of agents actually matters. Content, do you negotiate over inputs, level of effort, or outputs, emissions targets and timetables? And then delegation to institutions, monitoring, enforcement, review, and things like that. So there's 5 different major dimensions to this. I don't know how to think and talk in 5 dimensions. I only know how to do 2. And so I want to just work through just 2 of the dimensions here and suggest to you some things that I hope you'll find to be somewhat counterintuitive. And they might help explain why we've had such trouble getting traction on this issue. So what I want to do now is talk about 2 major dimensions of choice. When we think about designing an international institution to deal with some kind of collective problem like global warming, or it could be depletion of the ozone layer, or it could be cooperative efforts to reduce tariffs that impede international trade, we have a whole series of international problems that countries share, and we design institutions to address those kinds of problems. I want to talk about 2 of the dimensions of choice in designing those institutions. One is the legal status of the commitments. Are the commitments legally binding, which means they get re-reviewed by governments and in effect integrated into domestic law? The process varies across different countries. Or are they non-binding? Are they agreements, for example, that a heads of state get together and they sign an agreement that says we're going to do this, but doesn't have necessarily any legal force? And then the participation geometry. Are you going to have a universal agreement where all countries are sitting around the table, or are you going to have various kinds of clubs? And all of these slides are posted or will be posted shortly on the website, the normal website. Hopefully we'll duck the question of what the actual address is. But the normal website will have all these slides if you'd like to have copies of the slides. And so let's think a little bit through these two dimensions of choice here. Almost all international environmental law, especially the canon of international environmental law, is down here in this corner, where we have legally binding treaties reviewed, and they're considered to be binding under international law, with essentially universal access, a few exceptions here and there. That's most of our experience here. This has worked very well in some problems where the governments, when they get together, know the structure of the problem, they know what promises they can make to each other, and they're able to codify those promises into law. The most famous example of that is the Montreal Protocol, which was the series of agreements that continue to this day that regulate the substances that deplete the ozone layer. I won't talk much about them, but there's some really interesting experiences where you have universal agreement but non-binding instruments. My own research has been a lot on food safety standards, something called the Codex Alimentarius Commission, where you have food safety experts from around the world. They get together, they talk about what is a safe piece of breaded fish, what is safe street food, if that's not an oxymoron, what is safe chocolate, and they negotiate these standards, and they don't put them into binding law, but they codify them and put them up on a website, and then if a country doesn't have its own food safety standards, it can easily and readily go to the international standards. They have an enormously influential body that is influential because everybody is a member, and also because it's flexible due to its non-binding structure. There's some really interesting issues that involve clubs, small groups of countries that focus on legally binding agreements, the early days of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that now today, as the World Trade Organization, has become a more universal agreement. Strategic arms control treaties are an example of this, where the stakes, if you get it wrong, are huge. And so you want a legally binding agreement so you're absolutely confident you know what the other countries are doing, and you only want sitting around the table the countries that really matter. So the classics are the SALT talks and other talks, strategic arms talks. The box that I think is interesting and is underexplored in the case of climate change, is the box in the upper left-hand corner, where you're working with small groups of countries, and so they're therefore flexible. The institution is much more flexible, and the commitments that are being made are not legally binding. Why does that matter? It matters because governments, and especially when heads of state are involved in these negotiations, governments are much more willing to make ambitious promises to each other in problems that are poorly structured, where they don't know what they can exactly comply with, if those promises are not legally binding. So it's completely contrary to what the conventional wisdom is and to what you would think is the way to deal with this problem, where you'd imagine that binding instruments must be more effective than non-binding instruments because the binding nature of the law makes them enforceable. But at the international level, exactly the opposite is true. The binding nature of the instrument makes governments risk averse. It makes them wary about putting on paper and then sending through national processes of review commitments unless they're absolutely sure they can comply with those commitments. And that is, I think, one of the most important insights that's emerging from rethinking the history of international environmental law and international cooperation more generally. Now, why do we care about this? And I'd like to suggest, in closing here, I'd like to suggest that we care about this for a handful of reasons. I'm going to look at 4 reasons and talk briefly about 4 reasons. The first is, this suggests that the diplomatic process of negotiating and putting agreements into place is really about risk management. If you think the problem at hand is you're worried about countries backsliding and you know how to codify useful commitments into law, then you want to be down here in this box. And that's been the nature of most of the most effective international environmental commitments. If you don't know what governments can actually promise, and the governments sitting around the table want to be ambitious, then you want to be up in this box. The political process today more or less delivers the opposite. When you have governments sitting around the table that say they're serious about doing something on global warming, they all adopt the conventional wisdom, which is that binding treaties are best, and they focus on negotiating, in this case, the successor of the Kyoto Treaty, and those negotiations are underway with a deadline at the end of this year. The Obama administration, when they come in, will re-engage with that process in a vengeance, and they will be down here in this box. Governments that want to look like they're doing something about the problem, but don't actually do something about the problem, find a way to get themselves up in this box. And that's what the Bush administration did, is when they bailed out of Kyoto, they set up a whole series of non-binding forums where they could talk about things, but they didn't actually achieve very much. And yet, if you really want to make progress, and you want to make very ambitious commitments, but you're not sure exactly what can be achieved, you want those governments that are ambitious, that are thinking about the problem down here in this box, to instead be using agreements that are non-binding and flexible but ambitious up here. A great example of this is the North Sea pollution control regime, barely studied regime in international environmental law, where the governments around the North Sea worked for 20 years in legally binding frameworks and made essentially no progress. And when they shifted from binding frameworks to non-binding frameworks, where heads of state, including famously Margaret Thatcher, made promises to each other, face-to-face promises that were ambitious but not binding, and then agreed to review those promises to each other and check up on their implementation every few years, that helped break the deadlock. And it resulted a little bit like the rabbit in the racetrack, in the dog racetrack, where the rabbit is always out in front of the dogs, and the commitments that were being made by these governments to each other were always more ambitious than the governments could actually honor, and they were kept accountable to those commitments through an intensive monitoring and review process. And once they became confident of what they could implement, they then came along and codified parts of those agreements into binding law. And I think that's the way the treaty system and the agreement system operates much more effectively. That's the first implication. The second implication I want to talk about just very briefly is for those of you who study cooperation theory and game theory and so on. There's a massive selection bias in almost all of our research on international environmental institutions. And that selection bias arises because almost all of the prominent examples of cooperation sit down in this box here. So almost all the research is about legally binding instruments that operate under special circumstances, and there's been very little attention to these other boxes here. Why does that matter? Because diplomats are very smart and talented. And when they know they're negotiating a legally binding commitment, they find a way to transform the commitment away from something that might engender lots of conflict and ambiguity and into something that is much more easily codified into binding law. This helps explain why the track record of compliance with legally binding international environmental agreements is almost 100%. It turns out that if you go back and you actually try to measure formal compliance with binding agreements, almost everybody complies with almost all their commitments almost all the time. And the reason is that the commitments get tuned so that compliance is assured. In effect, you move the goalposts around. And yet, if you get serious about the climate problem, the last thing in the world you want to be doing is moving the goalposts around so that everybody can be sure that the ball actually falls between the two vertical posts. The third implication of this is that I think you should expect to see that as governments start to get more serious about the climate change problem, they're going to realize that efforts down here, which are not, I'm not saying they're irrelevant, they don't do the heavy lifting. And you're going to see much more effort with non-binding, more flexible forums. And I think one way to interpret now the fact that the G8 process and the G8+5, which is a regular get-together of the heads of state of the major industrialized countries and the major developing countries, the 5 major developing countries, climate change is more or less the only issue that is regularly on their agenda. They've made some pretty ambitious commitments to each other, and you're starting to see some progress being made in that forum and a variety of other forums. The fourth and last thing I want to talk about in terms of implications, in some sense, comes back to the university and comes back to what we study and the kinds of regulatory instruments we study. If you think the real world is going to be multi-speed and different governments are going to have different interests in the climate problem and different ability to actually put policies into place, then part of the conventional wisdom that was built into the Kyoto Treaty is almost certainly not going to be true. And that was the conventional wisdom that we should create an international market for emissions credits and that there would be a single international price as that market actually started to integrate. What's happened in reality is exactly the opposite. And the people who study this, especially from the perspective of economics, quite rightly say the most efficient outcome would be a single market on a single price, because then companies could shop the world and find the lowest cost way to control emissions. That is absolutely 100% true in theory. And in practice, governments are doing exactly the opposite. This chart, something Danny Cullenward and I first worked on a couple years ago, shows over time, back to January 2002, the trading experience in all the major carbon markets around the world, all the major markets that governments have created in one form or another to try and trade the right to pollute carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Mostly they're focused on carbon dioxide. The vertical axis is price, dollars per metric ton of CO2 equivalents, and the horizontal axis is time since the first market, which was a market that Britain set up to trade the right to avoid a tax, so it's kind of like a carbon market. And since that first British market, we've had a market in New South Wales, even as the Australian government, until very recently, was hostile to Kyoto. The province of New South Wales had its own system. We have a system down here that is the clean development mechanism in the purple circles. The red dots here are the Chicago Climate Exchange. So even though the US hasn't had a binding limit on carbon dioxide emissions, some companies and universities and some governments have gotten together and created a voluntary, semi-voluntary system called the Chicago Climate Exchange. And the size of the bubbles here is proportional to the volume traded in a typical trading period on the exchange. The largest market by far is the emissions trading system, the ETS of the European Union. Highest prices, largest volumes, and not surprisingly, over time, the clean development mechanism credits have more or less marked themselves off the European market because they are more or less the main instrument that Europe is using to comply with the Kyoto Treaty. What you see there is not the hypothesis that was built into Kyoto that we would have a single price. In fact, what you see is a multiplicity of prices. And what's happened over time is that as more governments have tried to tackle the problem, we have not seen convergence in price. In fact, we've seen divergence in price. RGGI, the coalition of northeastern states in the United States that are setting up their own trading system, they've had 2 auctions in the last 5 months, trading at about $3 a ton. New Zealand is setting up an auction. I believe it just went live in January 1 of this year. I think most people expected the prices to be somewhere in the low tens of dollars of CO2. California, of course, is setting up its own system as well. Why is this? Why is it that actual experience is so different from what we think should be the most economically efficient outcome? And the reason is that we have no capacity to allocate and assign and monitor and enforce property rights at the international level. The institutions for doing that exist inside the nation state or below the nation state, first point. And the nation states that are doing this have different willingness to pay, different interest in the climate change problem, and that's reflected in the price. It's a really, really important point because the markets that are actually emerging are reflecting this enormous divergence in interests and are likely to be very fragmented for the foreseeable future. Another part of this is, well, people say, well, that's maybe the situation today, but it'll change in the future as the big markets start to integrate with each other, and especially as we get the developing countries involved. And nobody thinks the developing countries are going to put a limit on their emissions anytime soon. But maybe you could take part of a developing country that's very well monitored and enforced and integrate that with the carbon trading system. And a logical candidate would be the electric power sector in China. Huge emissions, huge potential for reducing those emissions, actually pretty well monitored, pretty well instrumented, so it's a reasonable candidate. What would happen if we had actually integrated the electric power sector in China with one of the big emissions trading systems, like, for example, the European trading system? And the answer is that the European trading system would have crashed in the last 3 months. This next slide shows you, this is work Richard Morse, Gong He, and some other folks in our group have been doing. This shows you electric power consumption by year, shown in these different numbers, the percentage change in power consumption in the Chinese economy since the year 2003. And until the last few months, the Chinese economy has been roughly flat, and its growth rate has been roughly flat, namely it's been growing like a weed, 10%, 20% per year, enormous growth rates, famously a coal plant every week or every day or every moment or whatever the number is that people cite, nobody actually really knows. And the economy has been producing more and more carbon dioxide emissions. But you could imagine integrating that economy with the European trading system. Until the last 3 months, the Chinese economy, at least if you measure it by their power consumption, is in the middle of an unbelievable free fall. And this line here for 2008, the red line here, shows that in the last 3 months, we've had 3 consecutive months of negative growth in power consumption in China. The preliminary data for December are 6.3% reduction year on year in Chinese power consumption. Suppose that economy had been integrated with the European, or that sector had been integrated with the European emissions trading system. The net change in the next couple years of carbon dioxide emissions from the Chinese, just the Chinese power sector due to this shock, would swamp everything that's happened so far by a factor of 10, maybe 20 under the Kyoto Treaty. I'm not saying this is being done as a strategy to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. What I am saying is that when we start getting serious about these trading mechanisms, we are in effect inventing a new form of money. And there are going to be all the same kinds of safety valves and controls on trade and so on that represent the early stages of inventing a new form of money. And I bet that it's going to take a long time to create truly integrated international trading mechanisms. So I've tried to suggest, here are some implications of this real fragmented and dispersed world that we're living in, the kinds of legal instruments that might be much more effective, which I think are going to be increasingly non-binding rather than legally binding, the kinds of negotiating strategies, which increasingly are going to be looking at clubs as opposed to trying to get every country on the planet around the same table. And I want to just close and say that we're going to be talking a little bit about this at a meeting on the 10th of February over at the Bechtel Conference Center in Encina Hall. We have a meeting to look at what's going to happen in natural gas consumption as countries start to tighten the screws on carbon dioxide because it looks like the consumption of gas could skyrocket, and that means that the things that you're reading about in the newspaper today in Europe and Russia could be our problem because we will increasingly become dependent on imports of natural gas by boat, notably gas that is more or less integrated with the European market. And what I've been talking about today is one part of a large book project that's underway, and I welcome your feedback on that. The part I've been talking about is a subset of how you might regulate emissions at the international level much more effectively. The other parts of our work relate to how you might engage reluctant countries, developing countries. How could you do better than the Clean Development Mechanism, which has been largely a disaster so far? How might you invest in technology? Everybody agrees that technological change is a solution to the problem. Everybody, including President-elect Obama, is envisioning tens of billions of dollars of new money going into technology, especially for public money. How would you actually spend that? Do we actually know how to spend very large amounts of public money, especially in the energy area where the track record is pretty weak? What would you do with those kinds of resources? And the last thing that I'm increasingly working on is how do you prepare for actual changes in climate? Steve Schneider and Mike Mastandrea have been doing a lot of really interesting work on adaptation. I'm going to try and say some things about that in my book. I'm spending more time thinking about not just adaptation, but also geoengineering. Because if you take these scenarios of climate change and extreme climate change really seriously, and you look at the fact that governments so far have basically done approximately zero, and they've basically adopted a set of conventional wisdoms about how to design instruments to deal with this problem that are not well matched to the problem, then you have to be pretty pessimistic, at least in the near term, about actual reductions in emissions. And that makes you think about things that you never thought you'd really spend time thinking about, including things like geoengineering. Let me stop there. I'd be happy to take any questions. Please.
I think you're being way too hard on yourself, because it looks like in the last 2 years, all this fussing about Kyoto is having some good results, because the world is getting a lot colder.
The world is getting a lot what?
Colder.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. But and if it's getting colder, which I won't accept as a proposition, it has not, the regulatory instruments at the international level have had no impact on behavior.
That was my point. There's a lot of fussing about it and so on. What's happening?
Please.
Have you published anything yet, or can you share a little bit on item 2 of engaging reluctant countries,
Yeah.
in particular China?
Yeah, so there's a piece on our website we just released in the last week or something on this issue. In brief, the problem is that the clean development mechanism, which rewards ultimately investors on a project-by-project basis. If you go to China and you build a wind turbine, and that wind turbine is generating electricity without carbon dioxide emissions, then you apply for a credit. And you're going to say, well, gee, if we didn't have this wind turbine, we would have had a coal-fired power plant. And the difference between the emissions in those two investments is a credit. And that credit you then take home to Europe and you cash it in and you use that for compliance purposes, and extremely valuable. Work that Michael Wara and I have been doing has called into question whether most of those credits actually represent real changes in behavior, or rather smarter people who are figuring out how to cook the books so that you make it look like you wouldn't have invested that money in the wind turbine, and now, gee, you invested the money in the wind turbine, and so on. That seems to be what's happening there. In my view, the clean development mechanism strategy will never work because of that problem of the counterfactual. And so that requires you to go back and rethink the problem from the beginning. And one way to rethink the problem is what we should be doing with the major developing countries is doing joint investments, especially on technology and infrastructure that are self-enforcing, so that once the investment is made, it helps put the country on a development trajectory, if you like, that has lower carbon emissions, but you don't know exactly how to quantify those emissions. Examples, helping to build out the natural gas infrastructure in China, which is something that Chinese want to do anyway. There's some problems with gas supply, and so some outsiders could help with that problem, and then that helps lock, doesn't change the game completely, but helps lock the country on a different trajectory. Really interesting things can be done in China, but especially India, on advanced power plant technology that would make coal-fired, at least to the margin, new coal-fired power plants more efficient. The paper that's on our website, it's called Climate Accession Deals, because it uses as the model the deals that are negotiated when a country joins the World Trade Organization. So these are very complex, multi-year deals that take a while to negotiate, but they can be extremely effective because of the way that they're structured. And that paper's on our website. It puts numbers on this and so on. Grace?
With the 2D matrix on international agreements, with non-binding agreements and club participation, can you assign a percentage compliance to those types of agreements? Or?
I think the compliance debate in international law is one of the most misleading directions of international legal research in the last 20 years. Starting about 20 years ago, international lawyers and some political scientists who got excited about this started trying to deal with a compliance problem and the compliance gap in international law. And everybody imagined that there was this compliance problem out there, and if we just closed the gap, we could make agreements much more effective. And as part of that, I spent 3 years of my life running a research group that actually went off and measured levels of compliance, and that's where we came to these shocking findings that compliance was actually perfect. The issue is not a compliance gap. The issue is keeping the rabbit appropriately out in front of the governments. And compliance with binding instruments has its place for problems that have been sufficiently structured so that you can make a meaningful commitment, put it into binding law, and then countries can actually go incorporate that and change their behavior. And I think, and I'm just repeating what I said in my opening remarks, I think the nature of the climate problem is exactly the opposite. And so worrying about compliance as opposed to effort and ambition is just completely the wrong thing to worry about. Please.
I think one of the biggest success stories in the United States scenario has been the emergence of renewable portfolio standards mandating that a certain portion of electric power generation come from carbon-free sources. One of the characteristics of those mandates is that they leave purchasing power in the hands of utilities so that there's cutthroat competition and price reduction among the technology providers, but investors in the technology sector know that there's a market that is not subject to the vicissitudes of what's today's price of natural gas or not. And moving from just 20 states or 25 states to all 50 states is certainly part of the discussion in Washington these days. I'm curious about your thoughts in regards to the same mechanisms internationally. Because when investors know that there's going to be a 20-year market for this much energy, it encourages development in technology. When someone spends, when someone buys a CDM credit that results from closing a dry cleaning plant or something, it does nothing whatever to foster cost reduction in the fundamental energy technologies. And long term, it is the rapid reductions in the cost of the clean energy technologies that urgently limit the outcome.
So let me say, I guess I can't comment on whether that's actually the most cost-effective way to think about the problem, but let me just say two comments about this. One about domestic policy, and the other about how you would do this internationally. I think what we're seeing with these renewable portfolio standards is something a little bit different, which is the normal political logic that explains most public policy, which is you have a series of concentrated interests that want something. In this case, this interest resonates with the goal of cutting carbon dioxide emissions, and they're trying to design policy that concentrates those benefits, in this case on their technology, and diffuses and hides the cost. And I think that explains the basic logic of renewable portfolio standards. This is not to disparage it. This is to say that it has this underlying logic. What I don't know is how long that logic survives as the apparent cost of these programs becomes much more evident. But what I will say this, which is I think most people who are serious about this problem have come to the conclusion that the price mechanism by itself doesn't actually do much heavy lifting. This chart, you used the example from the United States. This chart shows the situation in Europe. So these are the same prices I showed earlier for the emissions trading system. They're in euros because we're just talking about Europe right now. Over time, these are December 2009 credits traded over time. This yellow line here is the price that carbon would have to be just to make the dispatch of an existing, already bought coal-fired power plant equal with an existing, already bought natural gas-fired power plant, which is an interesting thing to ask because gas has much lower emissions of CO2 per unit of electricity than coal. And to make a long story short, in effect, just to take existing technology and dispatch it in a way that's different would require a carbon price that's roughly double current prices. And I think you're seeing this actually everywhere. That it's not that the price signal is irrelevant, it is that the price signal on its own is not causing these kind of immediate flips in behavior that we see coming out of a lot of our models with these knife edge properties.
We're talking past each other because you're talking about two fuels, and I'm talking about what drives technology cost reduction. And RPSs, the existence of them, is the reason why wind power today is 1/20th per kilowatt hour of what it was 20 years ago. And had those RPSs not existed, the private sector would not have made the investments that leads this wind power is now cheaper than new coal power in the United States. And the negative carbon cost, you can't capture that just as a proxy cost.
And my point is that that logic actually applies in almost all aspects of the carbon system. And you are going to see, exactly as you said in the case of RPSs, you are going to see much more direct regulation and direct incentives on particular technologies and clusters of technologies. Now, one last word on this, which is you should expect to see then, if we were more serious about negotiating packages of commitments at the international level, then one of the things the governments could promise to each other would be, I'm going to do the following X, Y, and Z on technology forcing commitments. And I'm going to do the following X, Y, and Z in terms of investments in clean coal. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z and a whole bunch of other things. Those packages of real effort that governments actually have control over are going to be extremely difficult to translate into emissions targets and timetables. And if governments continue to try and negotiate with each other and have the currency of their negotiation as a set of output measures, emissions targets and timetables, over which they actually have very little control because other factors dominate the trajectories of emissions, then we're not going to have people coming to the table and promising the real kinds of measures that you're talking about. So, sorry, I was trying to get to that point, but to underscore that I think actually we're seeing everywhere not the kind of behavior that we expected to see in terms of response to price. And I'm not saying that price doesn't matter. It helps get the system oriented in the right direction. But price is not what's actually doing the heavy lifting. And interestingly enough, it's these kinds of policies that governments have much more direct control over that are doing the heavy lifting. Please, sir.
Two things. The report you have seems to be the reverse order. You're using something called schedule. The schedule of new technology is 20 years from research and accumulating the next round of commercial installations is another 25 years. And of course, out of sight, the background countries that try to meet the objectives. So the real answer to the issue is adaptation. And how do you deal with how long it takes to put a program together that meets the targets?
So I think in the ideal world, governments would get together and they would make commitments that have extremely long time horizons, because then the time horizon of the agreement would match the scale of the problem here. That world doesn't exist because it is very hard for governments to make promises to each other that are credible. And that's why this seems completely disconnected from reality, where people are focusing on 2008 to 2012 as the time periods when in reality what we care about especially is what happens in 2030 and 2050 and beyond. But the reason that this stuff, seemingly irrelevant stuff about 2008 to 2012 and in the successor period after Kyoto, 2013, presumably to 2018 or a little bit beyond that, the reason that stuff matters is because it's about governments restricting their behavior and channeling their behavior and demonstrating that what they're doing is credible. So I agree with you completely that the timescales are mismatched. Now, there was another part of your question which implied that therefore adaptation is really the big issue. And I don't see them as substitutes. I think you have to view adaptation, other people in this room know much more about this than I do, as an essential part of a system that's changing. And preparing for adaptation is part of what you would do to get ready for those changes while not losing sight of the fact that fundamentally we have to make big reductions in emissions. Michael?
I'm curious, David, what your take is. I mean, this figure shows partly that Europe is doing nothing. Your earlier figure showing the historical curve for CO2 emissions in Europe. But it also does show that Europe has put a pretty hefty price on carbon, albeit not enough to cause switching from coal to gas for baseload generation. I'm curious what you think about the 2020 program and whether you view that as input or output regulation, whether you view it as what would have happened anyway?
Yeah. So let me say two things about this briefly. One is, I think what we're seeing in these emissions trading schemes is, and the European model is the greatest example of this, is that governments are adopting these price mechanisms, realizing the prices on their own aren't doing the heavy lifting, and then they're adding to them all the kinds of things we just discussed, like these aggressive programs on renewable energy and so on. And those are things that they can control much more readily because governments actually pull those levers and they can make commitments to each other. And so in that sense, I think that's an effort, an effort-based kind of program. I think you're also seeing that in effect, and this is a little bit off the topic of your question, in effect what governments are doing is they're managing the price of these emissions trading systems. So Europe has regulated the valve a little bit to allow more CDM credits or fewer CDM credits into the European market. The Edison Electric Institute here in the United States just released a proposal yesterday, I think, that is a US electric power kind of consensus view on what could happen in the United States that envisions a collar around a carbon trading program. And what a lot of people are doing now is, in effect, trying to create a carbon tax, but not call it a carbon tax. And that's because, in my view, fundamentally, the politics of the carbon tax are nasty, brutish, and short. Namely, poor Steve Chu is testifying and having to backpedal on everything he said about how higher energy prices would be good for the country, when, of course, that's actually true. And so you can't talk about that directly. But with a cap and trade program, you can pretend, A, you don't have a tax in place, and B, more importantly, you create an incredibly valuable property right in the beginning that you get to give out to your friends. And the real politics of regulating carbon using a price instrument are the politics of how you allocate those emission credits. And I think part of the reason that this high price has not actually affected behavior in Europe very much is because the really big players here so far have been operating in a world where they're more or less given almost all of their emission credits for free. And that allocation is endogenous. So if you're a big lignite-fired power plant in Poland, and you're thinking about building another lignite-fired power plant in Poland, you know that so long as you don't change your behavior too much, you'll be given those emission credits for free. And so it looks like the posted price is very, very high, and the actual effect on behavior, I think, is very small. And I think people who model this stuff, this is the frontier of modeling in this area, is to try and actually model behavior in a world where the carbon markets are fragmented and where the allocation rules are endogenous to the behavior of the market. Okay, thank you.